There are moments in history when time itself seems to split, when the world, as we knew it, shatters. World War II was one of those moments. It wasn't just the scale of destruction, though that alone was unimaginable. Cities reduced to ash, millions of lives extinguished. The silent horror of Auschwitz, the blinding, inhuman flash over Hiroshima. It was as if the very soul of humanity had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. When the smoke cleared, something deeper had changed. People didn't just grieve for the dead, they grieved for the death of meaning. The philosophies that once held the world together, rationalism, progress, nationalism, stood hollow. The Enlightenment's promise that reason would guide us to a better future had been tested and failed. Science, which once stood as a symbol of human triumph, had also delivered the atomic bomb. Even religion, for many, seemed unable to account for the magnitude of the moral collapse. In the silence that followed, a single urgent question echoed across a broken continent. If everything we trusted could lead us here, then what still matters? What does it mean to live in a world where morality has faltered so catastrophically? Where meaning itself feels like a casualty of war? This wasn't just an intellectual crisis, it was a spiritual one. And from that void, a new voice began to rise. It was not loud, not even certain, but it was honest, unflinching. This was the voice of existentialism, a philosophy not born in universities but in ruins, in silence, in the ache of survival. It didn't offer easy answers. Instead, it dared to ask, how do we live now? And that's where our journey begins. After the war, Europe didn't just lie in physical ruins. It lay in philosophical silence. Buildings could be rebuilt, roads could be paved. But how do you restore trust in the human spirit after it has betrayed itself so completely? From London to Berlin, from Warsaw to Paris, the devastation wasn't just something you could see. It was something people carried in their eyes. In every collapsed cathedral, in every abandoned station, in every face that looked older than its years, the war had stripped away illusions. And what was left felt bare, exposed, painfully honest. The old anchors, religion, government, even the Enlightenment belief in reason and progress, had all been shaken. Institutions had either failed to prevent the catastrophe or actively enabled it. The church, for many, felt complicit in its silence. Science, once revered, had delivered mass death. Democracy had wavered, and fascism had marched through its cracks. The comforting narratives of moral progress no longer held. And in that vacuum, people began to ask questions that were not just political or economic, but profoundly human. This is where existentialism began to take root, not as an academic trend, but as a survival instinct. A way of thinking that didn't shy away from uncertainty, but embraced it. A philosophy that didn't offer answers, but gave people permission to ask the only question that still made sense. How do I live, now that the world has no clear meaning? In post-war France, this spirit found a home, not in dusty lecture halls, but in cafes buzzing with cigarette smoke and political arguments. In the corners of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, writers, students, and survivors gathered not to escape the darkness, but to understand it. To stare directly into the abyss and still try to find a way forward. There was defiance in that. And hope, too, though it looked nothing like the hope of the past. And in the middle of it all stood one voice that would shape this new search for meaning, not as an abstract idea, but as a human responsibility. His name was Jean-Paul Sartre. In the heart of post-war Paris, one man became the voice of a generation lost between the rubble and the future. Jean-Paul Sartre didn't speak from a place of certainty. He spoke from experience. During the war, Sartre was captured by the Germans and imprisoned in a POW camp. And it was in that prison, stripped of comfort, stripped of freedom, that the foundation for his defining work, being and nothingness, began to form. For Sartre, the war was more than history. It was a revelation. It exposed the illusion that life had any built-in meaning, any divine script. In its place, he offered something terrifying and liberating: the idea that existence comes before essence. We are not born with a purpose. There is no cosmic blueprint. We simply exist. And then, we must choose what that existence means. This was the heartbeat of Sartre's philosophy: radical freedom. Not the comfortable kind that comes with rights or choices handed down from society, but the kind that lives in every decision, every moment, every breath. And with that freedom comes responsibility. You are the author of your life, no one else. But freedom, Sartre warned, is heavy. Many flee from it. They live in bad faith, hiding behind roles, traditions, excuses, anything to avoid the weight of self-creation. But to do so is to lie to oneself. True authenticity, he argued, comes only when we stop pretending. When we look at the void and still choose. Choose love. Choose action. Choose meaning. After the war, Sartre didn't retreat into philosophy. He stepped onto the political stage. His ideas about freedom became fuel for activism, against colonialism, against oppression, against silence. He supported Marxist revolutions, not because he believed in utopias, but because he believed in the necessity of moral engagement. Existentialism for him was not a retreat from the world. It was a call to shape it. And yet, not everyone agreed. Sartre's optimism about freedom clashed with another voice, one quieter, more cautious, more rooted in the absurd. Because if there is no meaning and no God and only freedom, then why not end it all? That was the question Albert Camus dared to ask. Where Sartre stood on the mountaintop of radical freedom, Albert Camus sat beside the silence of the void. His voice wasn't as sharp, but it was just as clear, and in some ways even more enduring. Camus didn't ask what we should do with our freedom. He asked something more primal. Why live at all? For Camus, World War II wasn't just a historical event. It was the great mirror that revealed life's absurdity. A world where innocent people died in gas chambers while others danced in the streets. A world where reason bowed to cruelty and hope dissolved under ash. In that world, the old answers didn't hold. God, meaning justice. They all felt like shadows on a wall. And yet, Camus didn't descend into despair. He refused to. In the myth of Sisyphus, he introduced the idea of the absurd man, the one who sees the universe as indifferent, meaningless, even hostile, and chooses to live anyway. He compared life to the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder uphill for eternity. A meaningless task, a pointless struggle. And yet, Camus ends with a startling line. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Because in that defiance, in that refusal to surrender to meaninglessness, there is a kind of quiet triumph, a dignity. Camus rejected nihilism, even as he acknowledged absurdity. He believed in beauty, in small human acts of courage, in choosing to care even when the universe doesn't. Nowhere is this more evident than in the plague, where ordinary people resist a deadly disease, not because it will save the world, but because doing good still matters. In the face of senseless death, they choose solidarity. That, for Camus, is the true rebellion. Unlike Sartre, Camus didn't believe in total freedom or political dogma. He distrusted ideologies, even the ones that promised liberation. For him, morality wasn't about revolution. It was about compassion, about refusing to become what we hate. While Sartre charged into history, Camus stood at the edge of it, asking us not to forget our humanity. And as these two minds debated freedom and absurdity, Europe itself was wrestling with something even more harrowing: the moral void left behind by genocide, silence, and unimaginable cruelty. There are events that don't just break hearts, they break frameworks. The Holocaust wasn't just a tragedy, it was a philosophical rupture. A moment so unspeakable, so systematic in its cruelty, that it shattered the very ideas upon which modern Western thought had rested. For centuries, we'd been told that reason would guide us, that science would elevate us, that progress was inevitable. Enlightenment thinkers had painted a picture of humanity slowly climbing toward truth and justice. But Auschwitz stood as the stark negation of that dream. Here was a horror engineered not by chaos, but by order, by rational systems, bureaucracies, technologies, calculated decisions. And behind it all, a silence from the heavens. Many began to ask, if this could happen, what does it say about reason? About morality? About God? In that silence, existentialism found new urgency. It was no longer just about personal crisis or abstract freedom. It became a tool for ethical reckoning. Because after such moral collapse, what remained was not theory, but responsibility. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas offered a profound response. For him, ethics didn't begin in rules or systems. It began in the face of the other, in the quiet, sacred encounter with another human being. To see their vulnerability, their suffering, and to feel called to respond. Levinas saw this as the only antidote to the dehumanization that allowed atrocities to occur. Existentialism, in this light, became a philosophy not of escape, but of accountability. Not just freedom, but obligation. In a world where everything had failed, it asked each person to look within and to begin again. And as Europe tried to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul, these ideas spread into art, into literature, into film, because philosophy was no longer confined to ivory towers. It was living in the streets, in the culture, in the hearts of a generation that could no longer pretend the world made sense. After the war, existentialism didn't stay locked in books or whispered in cafes. It spilled into the very fabric of culture. Because when the world stops making sense, it's not just philosophers who respond. It's artists, writers, filmmakers. They speak the language of feeling, of image, of silence. And in the wake of global trauma, their work became the new scripture for a generation adrift. Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong partner and an intellectual force in her own right, carried existentialism into the realm of gender, ethics, and personal becoming. In The Second Sex, she famously declared, "One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman." It was existentialism through a feminist lens. Freedom, not as theory, but as lived struggle. Meanwhile, in literature and theater, absurdity took center stage. Franz Kafka, though he died before the war, was rediscovered with fresh urgency. His characters trapped in meaningless systems echoed the bureaucratic nightmare of totalitarianism. Samuel Beckett took this even further. In Waiting for Godot, two men linger on a barren stage, waiting endlessly for someone who never comes. The play offers no answers, no resolution, just waiting. It was post-war paralysis rendered in dialogue. The absurd made visible. Cinema too caught the existential wave. Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal gave us the haunting image of a knight playing chess with death itself. Here was man's search for meaning set against a godless silence. The plague looms, faith wavers, and still, the game continues. It's existentialism not as argument, but as atmosphere. And in visual art, figures began to distort. Francis Bacon's paintings showed twisted, screaming bodies, not as monsters, but as reflections of post-war anguish. Flesh blurred into shadow. Faces collapsed into voids. His canvases didn't ask you to understand. They asked you to feel the rawness of being alive in a broken time. In all of these, existentialism wasn't an idea. It was a mood, a presence, a weight. It had escaped the pages of philosophy and entered the bloodstream of a generation. And as that generation grew restless, the existential questions began to fuel something else, a deeper rebellion, one not just of the mind, but of conscience. By the 1950s and 60s, existentialism had already left the cafe and entered the streets. It was no longer just a way of thinking. It had become a way of resisting. And for many, the existential call to authenticity wasn't just personal, it was political. Jean-Paul Sartre, always restless, took his philosophy beyond the page. He aligned himself with revolutionary causes, embracing Marxism, but on his own terms. For Sartre, existentialism and Marxism shared a common root: the belief that human beings are not fixed, but shaped by their choices and their environment. He spoke out against French colonialism, especially in Algeria, and defended the right of the oppressed to rise against their conditions. Freedom, he insisted, meant nothing if it was not lived, and if others were still in chains, then none of us were truly free. This sense of moral responsibility, born from existential freedom, became the heartbeat of rebellion. It echoed through the student protests that rocked France in May 1968. The young, disillusioned with capitalism, with consumerism, with dead ideologies, took to the streets. Their slogans were existential: be realistic, demand the impossible. Boredom is counter-revolutionary. They weren't asking for new rulers. They were demanding new meaning. Existentialism offered them something religion, tradition, and politics had failed to deliver. The idea that their lives were not only theirs to shape, but theirs to fight for. It rejected conformity. It challenged bureaucracies that treated people like numbers. It resisted the cold logic of systems that forgot the soul. And it inspired people to become more human, not just in thought, but in action. This rebellion wasn't perfect. It was messy, idealistic, sometimes contradictory, but it was real. And it marked a turning point where existentialism became more than a philosophy. It became a posture, a refusal to accept the absurd without pushing back. Yet while this spirit burned in Europe across the Atlantic, another version of existential discontent was emerging. One less political, perhaps, but no less profound. In post-war America, the search for meaning took a different path, into anxiety, rebellion, and the quiet ache of freedom. While existentialism was igniting protest and philosophy in post-war Europe, its quieter twin was stirring across the Atlantic. In America, the existential crisis didn't roar. It simmered. Veterans returned home from the war with medals and trauma, stepping into suburban dreams that suddenly felt strangely hollow. The victory had been won, but something sacred felt lost. A silence settled in, restless, anxious, unresolved. This emotional undercurrent found its voice in American literature. In The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield wandered through a world he couldn't connect with, searching for something real amid all the phoniness. In Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman crumbled under the weight of the American dream, chasing a meaning that always seemed just out of reach. These weren't grand revolutions. They were quiet implosions. Existentialism, American style. And then came the beats. Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs. These weren't philosophers, but seekers. They rejected conformity, 9-to-5 routines, and manicured lives. Instead, they lit out on the road, seeking raw experience, ecstatic freedom, and spiritual depth in jazz clubs, deserts, and dive bars. For them, existential authenticity wasn't in theory. It was in movement, spontaneity, and the refusal to live anyone else's script. They wrote with fire. They lived with urgency. They turned living itself into a question. What if freedom is the only truth that matters? This was existentialism in denim and beat-up notebooks. Less abstract, more embodied. And though it burned bright for a time, by the 1970s the movement began to fade. Structuralism, postmodernism, and other schools took the stage. But existentialism never disappeared. It left a mark, in literature, in protest, in the quiet despair and hopeful defiance of every soul who ever asked, "What am I doing here?" And even now, in our own uncertain times, that question continues to echo. By the late 20th century, existentialism began to lose its cultural spotlight. The rise of structuralism and postmodernism shifted the focus away from the individual and toward systems. Language, culture, power structures. For some, the age of the existential hero seemed over, replaced by a more fragmented and skeptical worldview. But the questions existentialism raised never truly went away. In fact, they've become even more relevant. Today, we face a world grappling with the climate crisis, artificial intelligence, mass displacement, and a growing sense of digital isolation. Algorithms shape our choices, virtual spaces blur the line between real and imagined, and technology evolves faster than ethics can follow. In all this complexity, we find ourselves circling back to familiar questions. What does it mean to be human? Are we truly free? And what do we do with that freedom, especially in a world that often feels absurd? Existentialism wasn't a doctrine, it was a mirror. And every time the world tilts into uncertainty, that mirror is waiting. When systems fail, when easy answers crumble, existentialism quietly returns. Not with solutions, but with courage. The courage to ask, to reflect, to choose. So no, existentialism isn't dead. It isn't even finished. It lives in every honest conversation, in every act of defiance against meaninglessness, in every person who dares to take responsibility for their existence. And the question it asks, how shall we live now, knowing what we know, is not just a relic. It is our inheritance. In the end, the heart of existentialism beats around a single aching dilemma. In a world where atrocities have unfolded, where meaning has collapsed, and where certainty seems forever out of reach, how do we still live authentically? Not perfectly, not heroically, but truthfully, fully, awake. The thinkers who emerged after World War II weren't just reacting to politics or culture. They were responding to something deeper, a fracture in the soul of the modern world. Existentialism wasn't just a philosophy, it was a diagnosis. It looked into the ruins and said, yes, everything has changed, but the question remains. That question wasn't about God, or nations, or systems. It was about you. About how you walk through a world that makes no promises. About how you choose, and create, and speak, even when the sky is silent. Yes, the war is over. The bombs have stopped falling. But the moral void it revealed, that aching space between who we are and who we claim to be, still haunts us. We see it in new forms, in new crises. We feel it in the quiet moments when we wonder if any of this matters. And that's why existentialism never really ended. It simply evolved. It whispers to every generation that faces collapse. You are still free. You are still responsible. You must choose what it means to be human again and again. Because even after the ashes, the question remains. And the courage to ask it is everything.